From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Oh, that was fun.
Thanks.
Two questions. One, what's your take on the speakership, what's going on there? And you said that the Congress does not have a moral issue at the scope of slavery. Some would posit that abortion is that argument. And what's your take on what Congress should do with that?
It's really not before Congress, the question of abortion. You know, the closest you have is funding Planned Parenthood, which, by the way, they can't really affect either. It's done through Medicaid, and that's in the states. But you know, there is nothing like people owning other people, and that really was, unless you really say you have to stop owning other people, there was kind of no other place to go. And but the speakership is very much reflective of what's going on in the presidential election. You know, there's a group inside the Republican caucus that basically does not want to have anybody that will compromise with the other side. And how you get anything done that way, well, you don't get anything done that way. But there's basically a sense of not wanting to get anything done, just wanting to say, you know, no. And that doesn't, I don't know how you elect somebody under those terms. And but some women, please raise your hands. This is all men with hands up.
Okay, all right. We got one on the side. I got you.
Man
all
here.
right.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts. I was a great fan of yours and Mr. Donaldson. But when you left, I went to a competitive network, unfortunately. I recently watched the, I'm having a mental blank here, Ken Burns' Civil War. And perhaps my memory is not there as it should be. I grew up during the initial first term of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I don't remember any conversation other than maybe Mary Lincoln about any women in that 12-hour thing. Have you had any conversation with Mr. Burns as
No,
to?
Ken and I are good friends, but that's just the way history's been told. And to me, I'm not talking about his series, because it was, as Doug said earlier, you know, most Civil War stories are told through battles and all of that. But the truth is that in general in history, women are omitted. I have a children's book of founding mothers that I'm happy to see is out there, and I went around to schools last year when it came out. It's wonderfully illustrated. And I talked to kids, and I would say to the kids, you know, in all those pictures that you see in all the history books, is anything missing? And the little boys would always say something absurd, you know, and there's some symbol or something, you know, they'd make it up. And finally, some little girl would shyly raise her hand and say, women, there are no women in the pictures. And I'd say, what, do you think there were women then? And they'd get all giggly because, you know, it implies sex. And, to me, if you don't write about the other half of the human race, you're not giving an accurate history. And so I think that it is very important to do. But even in that HBO series on John Adams, they did not give Abigail Adams. That series and that whole long thing, the words "Remember the ladies" were never in that series. Really.
Cokie, are you familiar with this new series that's coming on PBS in January called Mercy Street?
No.
It's about some of your characters.
Good.
But they've been filming it in Richmond. It's set in Alexandria, but it's essentially PBS's attempt to do a Downton Abbey. But it's an elaborate period drama. But it's during the Civil War. It's all focused on the women nurses, and so many of the same folks you talk about pop up in it. I saw a preview of it at a PBS conference yesterday in New Orleans.
Well, it'd be hard to do Downton Abbey in Richmond during the Civil War when people were starving.
Yes, well, no, it's a different kind of Downton Abbey. Different kind of, yes, and legs being whacked off. But in deference to Cokie, let's go to one of the ladies who does have a hand up. There's one right behind you. There we go. Sorry, Fred.
My understanding is that, parallel during this period was a beginnings of the equal rights movement. Could you speak to that?
Well, of course, Seneca Falls happened in 1848, and which is when this book begins, but not at Seneca Falls. Look, to do a Civil War book is so diffuse that I had to find a construct to confine it. So Washington is the construct. And so it all takes place in Washington pretty much, with some flashbacks when the women come back, that kind of thing. But so the women of Seneca Falls, though, do show up because they got active during the war. They put the fight for women on hold to fight for slaves, but then when the 15th Amendment happened and slaves got the right to vote, the women started getting very upset. And the book ends with the women's suffrage convention in Washington right at the time of the Grant inaugural, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton saying, unless women participate, it's just going to continue to be this. The men have clearly screwed it up, and we've had 600,000 dead people, and we need women's participation. So it was very much part of the conversation coming out of the war. Absolutely.
Thank you for being here. I taught history for quite a long time, and history's always been taught as top-down management.
Right.
And I would compliment Ken Burns and his ilk, because for once, finally, you were seeing it from the bottom up, from the average person up. And so even though it was not mentioning a lot of women, it performed a vital function.
Right.
And so mine is more of a statement than a question to you. I hope to encourage you and others out there to write more about women, because it's the age of enlightenment. And I think the more you engage students from bottom up as opposed to top down, the more interest you'll have in history, and the more involved and connected kids will be, because they turn off very, very quickly. But if there's something in it that they can understand and relate to, and this is your writing is just part of the process of the changing and the way history is taught.
Right.
Let's grab another question real quick, though.
Okay.
Thanks, Doug. I wanted to say thank you for being here. Just a little note. Back in 1937, a woman graduated from Vassar, #1 in her class, went to Columbia Law School, became the senior partner of my law firm. Her name was Harriet Pilpel, who in firing line and Bill Buckley stood head to head with him, and I think outdid him. She came to the firm because in 1926, the firm, which was Greenbaum, Wolfe, and Morris Ernst, represented Margaret Sanger in opening up the first birth control advice clinic, a precursor to Planned Parenthood Federation of America. We admired her. I admired her. I miss her very much.
Now you were probably close to being unique at that time, because women graduating top of their classes at law school were still having trouble getting jobs well into the 1960s, 70s.
Saturday O'Connor story, yeah.
Right. In terms of the teaching of history, there actually has now been, not necessarily in terms of teaching history, but in terms of doing history, a lot of historians doing a lot of bottom-up history, a tremendous amount of it. What still was missing, however, was these women who were the wives of the elite. Their stories had never been told, and so I think that there is a huge vacuum there that needed to be filled. But what's so great about women's history, period, is that women's letters are just so much better than men's letters. No, seriously, because the men's letters, the men are, the men are aware that what they are doing is important and that their letters will be preserved and published. And they write that way. They edit them, they're conscious. The women just write letters. And so one letter will have, you know, very much what the political situation is and what the woman's views of it are politically, but also who's having and all too often losing babies, who's getting married, what the fashions are, what the economic situation is. So you get a far fuller picture of American society through the women's letters. And they're much funnier. They're funny and frank. I mean, Verena Davis writes about how Stephen Douglas stinks. And, you know, so you get a much fuller picture of life through the letters.
Cokie, are you as encouraged as I am at the increasing numbers of young women who are going on to college and graduate school? As to this gentleman's point, I went to law school in the early 60s. There were, in a class of 550, there were less than 20 females. That particular school now has over 50% of its first-year class females. I'm teaching now. My class is filled with young women. And what I've noticed is that young women, because I think they see that there is something at the end of the rainbow, work harder. And they have a good...
They've always worked harder.
Well, but I mean... Wait a minute. But this is a twofer. They've worked harder often than their male counterparts until about halfway through the semester. I know Susie Q, says the guy. Maybe I'll get into this picture and do the reading for next week.
Maybe.
So it lifts all boats.
Well, as I said earlier, I think that the fact is that, I mean, the numbers are incontrovertible. The majority of our college graduates are female. 2/3 of our graduate school graduates are female. And that's why we have to have a society that understands that and makes it possible for those women to be as productive as they can humanly be.
Thank you for being here on this particular day. I'm a retired teacher from California, moved here 5 years ago to Virginia, and these women with me are retired teachers, and we were part of a group called New Voices. And we started with the Women's History Project out of Santa Rosa. And I was appalled because we had 1 month. Women's History Month was March, and that was all. And we tried desperately to get books into our curriculum, and we thank you for this book for the future.
Well, thank you. Actually, all three of my big history books, Founding Mothers, Ladies of Liberty, and this, I wrote very much with school girls in mind, and boys too, it wouldn't hurt them. So they are written in a completely accessible way. They're basically written the way I talk.
I would like to hear your evaluation of Eleanor Roosevelt as a woman in leadership.
Well, obviously, she was a very influential and effective woman in leadership. She played a different role than many of the other women, partly because Franklin Roosevelt was confined, and so she became his eyes and ears. But also, she had her own very strong views, and sometimes they clashed dramatically, but sometimes he also used her as sort of a foil for saying to others, you know, my wife has given me grief on this, you know, and so I think that she was obviously someone of tremendous importance. In my own field, she insisted that only women journalists come to her press conferences, and therefore she promoted women journalists at a time when they were shut out of pretty much every journalistic institution. So she, you know, created a space where the men were shut out, and it was a space that was very important.
Thank you, Cokie. It's been very delightful having you here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Your family have been in politics. You mentioned your father serving, your mother, and I don't think you mentioned your sister Barbara, who was the most dynamic mayor of Princeton. She really was. Things happened in Princeton when Barbara was mayor. But my question to you is, why aren't you running for political office?
Well, now I'm old. But the truth is, I've always felt guilty for not doing it. I'm the only member of my original nuclear family not to have run for Congress. They didn't all win. My mother's the only one who never lost an election. But I met my husband when I was 18 and he was 19, and he was always going to be a journalist. So it would have been a little hard on him if I had gone into politics. But I have tried to sort of make my contribution by explaining politics and policy and hoping that that helps inform voters who can then...
I mean, it is a legitimate issue that with some of the Republicans, the Freedom Caucus, as they call themselves, you know, the compromise is capitulation. And if you're a purist, then that's a very difficult thing to do.
Well, then you don't run for Congress. You know, I mean, Congress, the word means coming together. That's what it means. And we are an enormous, geographically and economically and ethnically diverse country. And what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another, and therefore compromise is necessary to get someplace. And seriously, if you feel that, you know, making the kinds of arrangements that get something passed is evil, then don't run.
So, Cokie, when it's all said and done, is everything going to be okay?
Yes. Yes, everything's going to be okay because it's a great country. That's another thing that makes me nuts in this election. Make America great again. America is great. And I think that we are going through a difficult time, but I look to the young people and I think that I see tremendous energy and sense of the future that's excellent. And the other place I look, and honestly, if you ever are in any kind of despair about this country, I recommend highly go to a naturalization ceremony. It is the most, I can't even say it without goosebumps. It is the most goosebump-provoking event of all time, where you see people, and I've been to two, one at Ellis Island, and one in the rotunda of the Archives of the United States of America, where people of every color, of every possible nationality, are standing in front of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, under these murals of white men in leggings and wigs, and taking the oath because they want to be American, and they contribute wonderfully to this country and constantly bring in new energy, new ideas, new inventiveness, new dedication. It's a great country.
That's great. Thank you so much.
From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.